This is GFree Radio. Here's your host, Peter Stewart.
And episode 65 is entitled All Change for U.S GF Rules and Regulations. Hello, welcome to the show. Now, cast your mind back a year, and then on the GFree Radio Show, we spoke with Jules Dowler Shepard on the changes to the regulations on labelling gluten-free foods in the United States. Indeed, we recorded our interview just minutes after the announcement of the changes had been made. This week on the show, we catch up with her just a few days before those packaging rules come into effect. Hear how the food industry in the United States and GFree consumers have reacted to the alterations and what will happen to manufacturers if they don't comply. Plus, Jules is going to be telling us what further changes she thinks are necessary to help keep those eating gluten-free safe. Also this week, how to make gluten-free flatbread. We join Ian Thackeray in the GFree Radio kitchen to get all floured up as we listen and learn about another great recipe in our monthly series. That recipe in a few moments' time, but first, Jules Dowler Shepard. Jules, thanks ever so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
And remind us, because we got some big dates coming up, haven't we, in the next few days, about the new rules and regulations which are coming into effect after we spoke about them last year. So remind us, what is happening in the US?
Well, you and I spoke about a year ago to date, actually, on this issue because the FDA, our Food and Drug Administration, had finally come out with their regulations on gluten-free food labeling. So we are finally playing catch-up and getting pretty close to having caught up with the UK and with the EU and their regulations. Ours look very similar to yours, but they were issued this time last year, and they are final and go into effect now here in August of 2014.
Okay, so I'm sure there are pages and pages and subsections and, various points and so on, 5.4.3a and all the rest of it. And
of course,
various
government, right?
annexes and addendums and all the rest of it.
That's right.
Absolutely, and I'm sure a lot of lawyers have been paid an awful lot of money to put it all together. But essentially, what are the top line? What are the headlines?
Well, again, as I mentioned, it looks a lot like what you have in the UK. If a manufacturer is going to label their product as, quote, gluten-free, then it needs to meet certain specifications. First and foremost is it must be less than 20 parts per million gluten in terms of how that's tested and what it looks like on a label and all of that. That's where it gets into the specifics that you were talking about, 5.4.3. But basically what the consumer needs to understand is that going forward after August of this year, if they pick up a package of food and it says gluten-free on it, they are supposed to be able to trust that the manufacturer has ensured that it contains less than 20 parts per million gluten, which is the standard that the doctors and the scientists who have been studying this for so long have decided is a safe threshold for people who have celiac disease. So in other words, if you have celiac disease and you consume a food with less than 20 parts per million gluten, they are saying that scientifically speaking, that it does not initiate a celiac autoimmune reaction in someone with celiac disease. Now, we know, because this is what we do all the time and talk to people who are living gluten-free all the time, is that there are lots of people who claim to have sensitivities that are actually more than, the 20 parts per million gluten. And so for those folks, they're going to have to take some extra steps and, look into the manufacturing process for each individual product a little bit further. See if it's a dedicated facility, see if it's a certified gluten-free facility in the U.S., the certifying agencies either certify to less than 5 parts per million or less than 10 parts per million, which gives people a little extra cushion there and also gives them some added measure of security. If a manufacturer does, going forward, label gluten-free and does not have a certification, they are free to label it gluten-free if they have taken steps to ensure that it meets this standard. Now, if a consumer has a reaction and believes that they have ingested a product that has been labeled gluten-free, they will now be able to go to the FDA, again, the Food and Drug Administration, which has certain enforcement abilities that they can then go back to the manufacturer and demand certain things. Where's your testing? Prove that your product is less than 20 parts per million gluten, that type of thing. And in extreme situations, they can order recalls. So there are lots of things that will be changing in the U.S. because of this, because until now, unless a product had been privately certified gluten-free, consumers just really didn't know if it was labeled gluten-free, if the manufacturer knew what they were doing or was doing any testing or was trying to prevent cross-contact in any way. So it was kind of a no man's land, and so this is going to be really helpful for consumers going forward to understand better what's in and what's not in the foods that they're purchasing.
It sounds though it was a bit of a Wild West situation, and now the sheriff has come into town and is he's doing a bit of gunslinging there.
Yeah,
absolutely, right. And the jail could be open for business. But I say jail. I mean, what are the issues if someone has been a little bit too loose with their labelling?
Well, as I mentioned, first and foremost, the FDA is going to go in and they're going to do some testing themselves. They're going to ask for product. They're going to, do the testing to ensure that it is less than 20 parts per million. They're going to go back and ask that the manufacturer show what steps they've taken to ensure that it's less than 20 parts per million. Were they testing? If they were, let's see your test results. If you weren't testing, then what gave you the thinking that you could actually label your product gluten-free. And so, it's kind of almost compared to an audit, going in and really kind of swooping in and looking through all the books and testing and taking samples. And, FDA, because we've had some recent problems in our country and frankly around the world, with some problems like salmonella and other things that have been really scary, FDA has recently, in recent years, been given more authority to really come down hard on manufacturers who are not doing what they're supposed to do according to their regulations, which could be, health issues like salmonella or E. coli, or it could be something like the celiac issue with gluten-free. So you could expect that there could be recalls that are forced upon these manufacturers. And in some cases, there have been companies that have been shut down because of extreme situations of unsanitary conditions and things like that. So they have that ability. You would hope that that would never come to pass with something like gluten. But, they sort of have a toolkit, if you will, of options that they can levy against manufacturers. And certainly if they investigated and found that there were bad actors, people who were doing this knowing that they were putting a product out that was that contained gluten, then, you could think that there would be some other criminal and certainly some civil actions that could be taken as well.
And is it just the words gluten-free? Is that enough, or do you have some other logo? I mean, over here we've got the crossed grain logo, which is kind of an extra reassurance that that product and the factory and the facilities have gone through an added test and check through the Celiac UK people. So you've got that added reassurance. Is there anything like that over there, or is it just the words gluten-free which are going to be enough?
Well, it's an excellent question, because this is where it gets confusing for the consumer, because, they're just looking for answers. They just want to know when they go into the store and they're looking in the grocery aisles, what the product is. Is it safe? Is it not safe? Is it gluten-free? Is it not gluten-free? And the FDA did something that was helpful in this regard, but also arguably left things a little murky. When you refer to symbols, we do have some symbols here in the United States. If those symbols are associated with these private groups that do the individual audits and certify products. In order to have, going forward with the FDA, if you want to label your product gluten-free, you do not have to engage one of these private certifying agencies and get that symbol. The FDA did not say that that was a requirement. So there will be some products that are labeled gluten-free and have no symbol, and there will be some products that are labeled gluten-free and have one of the possible symbols that are associated with these certifying agencies. What I always tell people in the past, and certainly even going forward, is if you see those symbols associated with those certifying agencies, that does give you the added measure of comfort, because not only is it up to the manufacturer to ensure that they're doing the right thing, these certifying agencies come in, they test, they train when necessary, they audit, and so they're going through these extra steps to make sure that the manufacturer, A, knows what they're doing, and B, complies. And so, I always recommend that people choose those products wherever possible. It's not always possible. And so in that case, the FDA did not issue a recommendation or a mandate for a particular logo or label. All they said was that it needs to say something like gluten-free or free of gluten. They didn't even say it had to say the words gluten-free. Those are the things that have to be on the product in order to indicate to the consumer that they are complying with the FDA's less than 20 parts per million standard. This is again where it gets even more murky. If a manufacturer instead says made without gluten ingredients or does not contain gluten ingredients or things like that, the FDA actually said that does not equate to the words gluten-free. Now, they're therefore saying that the customer or the consumer who's purchasing that product cannot rely on the fact that product is less than 20 parts per million of gluten.
But the customer isn't necessarily going to know the difference between those kinds of phrases. And this sounds like weasel words for a manufacturer who wants to get out of something and say, I was following the rules. I
know, but, they do say, the FDA does say, well, they have to make those claims in good faith. They have to truly not put gluten-containing ingredients into the product, but they're not saying anything about cross-contact or incidental exposure, that type of thing. So the facility could be rampant with gluten, if taking this to the extreme, but the gluten-containing products were not ingredients in that product. But the manufacturer didn't want to say we're going to comply with the less than 20 parts per million gluten, so they didn't go so far as to say it's gluten-free. Yeah. But they say it's made without gluten ingredients. Okay. That, to me, is really, really dicey. And, it's almost like the customer needs a degree in understanding, label reading and in order to be truly safe, which is why I say that the FDA did take some strides in the right direction. But there are many of us who feel like they really dropped the ball on some other things like this.
Absolutely. Well, to carry on our gun analogy, it's playing a bit of Russian roulette, isn't it, really? Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can feel like it as a customer.
Absolutely. It certainly can, can't it? My guest in this week's episode of GFree Radio Show is Jules Dowler Shepard. And if you want to connect with her, we'll give her a chance to give you all of her details in a few moments' time. And we'll speak some more in a few moments' time.
Hello, I'm Ian Thackeray from Gluten-Free Baking and Living, and it's my turn to be in the kitchen to show you one of my favourite recipes, which is a flatbread. This came from a desperation one Sunday morning when we didn't have any bread in the house, and gluten-free or any other sort for that matter, so I invented this. We use gluten-free flour from Bob's Red Mill, big American company. This particular one is called a garbanzo and fava flour. Translating into English, that's, we believe, chickpea and broad bean flour. On the list of goodies for this particular recipe, we have garbanzo and fava bean flour, we have salt, some bicarb of soda, and we have some buttermilk. Now, don't panic about the buttermilk. It's very, very easy to make up. Simply add either vinegar or lemon juice to milk, and that's it. That makes buttermilk. If you are dairy-free, use a soya milk or the milk of your choice that you use, and simply add the lemon juice or the white wine vinegar, and that will work really well as well. So you take the 100 grams of the Bob's Red Mill flour, add the other dry ingredients, the salt and the bicarb of soda, sift them together to make sure they're blended right the way through, and then mix in the buttermilk. And as you're mixing it in, it turns gradually into a really sticky dough, which is typical of lots of gluten-free products. It is the major difference between cooking with wheat and cooking gluten-free is the liquid content of gluten-free has to be much, much higher for most things. Anyway, you end up with a very, very sticky dough. Don't worry about that. Because it'll sort itself out in the handling when we form them into the balls. Leave it for 10 to 15 minutes. It helps it just helps it rise slightly. If it doesn't rise, don't worry too much about it. But it's nicer if it does. Okay, this has had a bit of a chance to rise. It's got a slight fluff to it. Put it on a lightly floured surface and roll it round until it's coated in the flour, so you can handle it without getting your fingers all sticky again. Break it into 4 pieces, which should come out about the size of a golf ball. When you've done that, press them with your fingers to make them out into a flat, roundish, flat, about 5 mil thick flatbread. Again, typically of gluten-free, it's quite a fragile dough, so don't try and pick it up with your hands. Get your fish slice or a spatula and slide it under the flatbread to transport it into the frying pan. Now, these are cooked in a frying pan on a medium heat, which has got about a tablespoonful of oil in it. We use olive oil, or you could also use rapeseed oil. It's also a very good oil. We tried, when I was developing the recipe, I tried just wiping the pan with oil, but that really didn't seem to work. It seems to need about a tablespoonful of actual oil standing in the pan for this to work. Anyway, once you've got that to the right temperature, simply place the flatbread in the pan and leave it for 2 to 3 minutes. Check it on the underside. If it's a light sort of golden brown, maybe darker brown in patches, turn it over and then just leave it. Again for 2 to 3 minutes, depending on how hot you've got your pan. It should rise slightly and be about a centimetre thick by the time it's done. Again, don't worry if it doesn't on your first couple of goes. It still tastes fantastic as a flatbread. Eat it straight from the pan. We had it with bacon and eggs. It was brilliant. But equally as well, you could develop this and use it as a flatbread to go with a curry, maybe a focaccia style with it, studded with garlic and rosemary is another one that springs to mind. It's very flexible. And the other good thing about this, of course, it's a completely grain-free flatbread. This is chickpea and broad beans. So if you're struggling with grains, as well as being celiac or gluten-free, it's a really good option.
GFree Radio. I'm Peter Stewart. My guest is Jules Shepard, and in the first part of our chat a few minutes ago we were talking about, the overview of the changes in the rules and the regulations for labelling in the United States, the gluten-free phrase, any symbols and things like that. But Jules, the FDA that you mentioned a couple of times, the Food and Drug Administration there, we're talking about food, aren't we? We're not talking about alcohol or any medicine or anything like that?
No. In the U.S., the FDA regulates foods and dietary supplements. So the regulations we're talking about now that come into effect in August of this year are really only pertain to food and dietary supplements. Specifically, when you're talking about things like alcoholic beverages, that is regulated by a different agency called the TTB here in the United States. Now, they try to follow one another's regulations and respect the standards that are set, and so we can expect that will pretty much hold true to form. But technically, the FDA does not have purview over things like alcoholic beverages, meats, things like that fall under the USDA. So this really only specifically applies to foods. Now, it's another tricky issue here because everyone says, well, all right, that's fine. Now I understand if I go to the grocery store that the FDA regulates the foods on the shelves. What if I go to a restaurant? How will I know if something is gluten-free in a restaurant?
Well, that's interesting because our restaurant rules here and indeed across Europe, change in the middle of December, where we're going to have much more clearer notification. You're going to have to, if you want to, ask your server or someone in the restaurant or the bar or the cafe, does this have gluten in? They're going to have something written down that you can ask to see. And there's going to be much more regulation in that arena. So what's the situation in the States regarding that? Are you a little bit behind us on that?
Oh, yes. Once again, we're a little bit behind you on that. It's almost like a gentleman's agreement. I don't know how else to describe it. The FDA initially did not mention restaurants. And then they said something like, well, we expect restaurants are going to also want to do this. And then because of pressure from the, those of us who have been involved in this process, saying that's really not good enough. We need more clarity on what's expected of the restaurants. And they said, well, we'll push them a little bit more on the restaurant issue. And they issued a statement in their questions and answers on their website, which is the way that they sort of answer these very popular questions. And they said that they expect that restaurants will follow the exact same standards as food manufacturers in that if a restaurant declares that a menu item is gluten-free, it needs to be less than 20 parts per million gluten. That's all they said. They didn't say anything about, okay, what happens if they aren't? What happens if they're not doing the right thing? I think in classic United States form, this is one of those things where they're going to say, for now, we're going to leave it to the market to dictate, what's happening with restaurants. We expect that restaurants are going to want to comply just to be good stewards and to be helpful, but that they're not exercising any authority over them such that they could be punished or penalized in any way. Now, I think, again, if it was shown that a particular restaurant was engaging in intentional contamination or willfully exposing people to gluten on a gluten-free menu, things like that, I think then you're opening yourself up to being, charged by criminally or even civilly by agencies other than the FDA. So it's not like there's nothing that could happen, but it's going to fall back on the customer to really push that if they were to be contaminated or if there was some, nefarious purposes that were discovered at a restaurant, which of course we would hope that would never happen. But the FDA just hasn't really taken any more strides in that direction. And I think it's because it's kind of murky as to whether they even have authority over the restaurants.
Interesting. So when I come to your fantastic country in October, coming into Colorado, doing the whole Yellowstone thing and touring around the Midwest there for a couple of 3 weeks, and I'm going into one of the chain restaurants. Let's make it easy. What should I be expecting? Because more recently, I've noticed they're much more up to speed with a gluten-free menu or an allergy menu. Should I not really be trusting that? How should I be feeling when I go into the bar restaurant?
It's a tricky business, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I'd love to mention a couple of names of chains, but I daren't because they may have got rather better in a couple of years since I've been over. Some are particularly good, but others, I felt decidedly dodgy afterwards, and that's a polite way of putting it.
Yeah, no kidding. It's unfortunate that we don't have a standard with oversight like that at this point in the U.S. What I can tell you is that, again, in the capitalistic frame of mind that most people have here in the U.S., they have taken it upon themselves to institute these types of oversight communities and even private agencies that have nothing to do with the government. So whereas the FDA says we expect restaurants to do this, we encourage restaurants to do this, they're not mandating it. And the question is, do they really even have the ability to mandate it? So in that vacuum, in that void, if you will, other groups have stepped in. There are some apps that you can get that will, they're sort of crowdsourced apps where the community will tell you, if you're in an area and you say, where's the best gluten-free restaurant here? Or I want gluten-free Thai food in Colorado or, wherever you are, there are these really helpful apps. And people will rate restaurants and say they had a great experience or they were sickened by being there. And that will very quickly affect that restaurant's business. And so, that's been sort of the norm for a while now. But there are also some new organizations that are in the business now of certifying restaurants. And so I think you're going to find it'll be better than it was the last time you were here, but it's still tricky to be sure which ones you can trust. And I would start first with crowdsourced information through these apps and then also on the internet. Do your homework before you travel. Look for restaurants that have a wonderful reputation in the gluten-free community that may or may not be chains. Oftentimes, I think it's not chains because, the more local, smaller restaurants that can make their own sauces and have control over what's going on in their particular environment are a little bit easier to control than necessarily a chain restaurant. But there are exceptions to that. And then I would also look and see the restaurants that have been certified. For example, there's a group called Train, and I actually do restaurant training with them, and I do webinars, and I go and help them do audits of restaurants to help teach the restaurants how to better handle gluten and other food allergens so that they can provide a safe meal experience for their diners. And then those groups, when they go through these trainings, get certain certifications that then they can put on their menu or on their window or on the internet. And that just gives you another layer of assurance, I guess, that they kind of know what they're doing. They're not in it just to be able to say, we have a gluten-free menu. They're actually trying to do it right. And so there's some more organizations out there doing that. And so you'll be able to do some searches and find restaurants that have taken the extra steps to get that type of training. And you'll find that in university settings here too, which is great. And even some more hospitals are getting on board. So, again, it's a private effort, though. It's not coming from the government mandating that they need to do anything in particular.
Okay. Well, finish up in a few moments' time by asking you for all your contact details so people can connect and follow you and read some more about what you're saying on this and other issues. But first of all, Jules, just before we go, let's swing back then to those changes in the rules and regulations that they come in the next few days. What's been the reaction amongst the gluten-free, the celiac community? Are they wiping their brow and thinking, right, well, that's good, the fight was won and now we can get on with our lives? Or are they saying, boy, oh boy, it hasn't gone far enough, or it's not what you promised us, or now we've got to do this and push and press for something else?
Well, you're always going to find people on both ends of the spectrum when something like this comes down. It's change, and it's not going to be enough change for everyone, and it's going to be too much change for other people. It's still confusing, which is unfortunate. One of the things that I don't like about the regulation is that it allows manufacturers of products that are naturally gluten-free to label them gluten-free, which then actually causes consumer confusion as well. You know, you see bottled water that says gluten-free on it, and you're like, oh, I didn't know that there could be gluten in my water. What about this bottle? It doesn't say gluten-free on it. Does that mean it has gluten in it? Like, it's really confusing.
Absolutely. We see all those pictures on Twitter, don't we?
Exactly, on a regular basis? Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, there are problems, right? But this is a great step in the right direction. And I think, you know, as with any regulation, any law, after it's implemented, there will be suggestions to modify, to tweak it, to perhaps reword things, maybe even to make it more aggressive if FDA finds that this is not enough and people are still being sickened and there's too much confusion, then they're going to have to revisit it, which it's perfectly allowable in the system to do that, and they're contemplating that they would as science evolves and we learn more about celiac disease and learn more about gluten sensitivity and other conditions that require a gluten-free diet. They may decide that less than 20 parts per million isn't enough, and maybe it needs to be less than 10 parts per million, or, I'm just speculating, but they've left the door open for changing the regulation as they need to in response to the community and need. Now, as we talked about last year, it was interesting because the FDA didn't even realize this was a community concern, because this is a voluntary labeling regulation. No one is telling a manufacturer that they have to use the term gluten-free on their product. So FDA viewed it as very low on the totem pole of importance because they thought it's not a big deal. When we built the world's tallest gluten-free cake back in 2011 to lobby the FDA to actually issue these gluten-free food regulations, and we met with the directors of the FDA who were in charge of this, they honestly were dumbfounded that the community was this up in arms about the fact that there were no regulations. They had no idea that it really affected us in the way that it did. How do you shop for your family when you're not sure the products are safe? And when we were in a room together and we explained it to them, and we had the press and the media and the thousands and thousands of people signing the petitions, they realized that it was important, and they moved it to the front burner, and they did what they said that they were going to do. And for that, I applaud them, because they, did finally issue the regulations. And we just have to see, people are not everyone's going to be happy with it, but it is definitely the step in the right direction, and we'll just have to stay on them if it needs to be changed, or we'll keep an eye on you guys, and we'll just copy you again, see what you're doing to make things better, and we'll push the FDA to do it too.
Excellent. Really appreciate that. The wheels of government can move slowly, can't they? And usually it's because they're tied up with all that red tape and, so all the different lobbyists shouting from two different directions with their own agendas, inevitably, whether it be a food company or a health company or someone wanting to have something go their way or the other.
Well, speaking of which, and you mentioned this earlier as well, the alcohol, the beer lobby has been really interesting in this whole thing, because there are now these beers, which you've had over in Europe for a while now, these deglutenized beers. Beers. And the beer lobby for these folks over in the U.S. tried to get these deglutenized beers to be covered under this regulation. And that would have really derailed the progress we had made, because we're going to be arguing over that for years to come, I'm certain of it. And so the FDA specifically said, nope, we're not going to deal with that right now, but we are going to address this in a separate regulation. So it's out there, they're working on it, and we're going to see what happens about food labeling for those deglutenized beers as well, which will be an interesting thing to be watching out for in the days and weeks and months ahead. Absolutely.
Watch this space. And if you want to watch the space, which is the website that Jules runs, then Jules, how can people see that? What's your address?
I can be found at GF Jules, which is GF, gluten-free, JULES.com. And the website for the organization that we founded to build the world's tallest gluten-free cake, which lobbied the FDA, is onein133.com. And actually .org, sorry. And you can also go there to see pictures of the cake and all the interesting facts and things like that. But yeah, I'll definitely be updating everyone on gfjules.com as things come down the pike. And if there's more news and information that come out about the regulations for the deglutenized beers as well, I'll be doing some more articles on that. I've already written about it in several magazines and done radio shows on it, and have articles on my site about that already. But I'm sure there'll be more to talk about.
Well, Jules spoke to us a year ago when the rules were first announced. In fact, soon after the rules were announced, I think within the hour.
I think it was within the hour.
Yes. We caught up with her, so we managed to get perhaps the first interview out on that week's GFree Radio Show a year ago. So fantastic, Jules, to catch up with you again to find out what has happened in the intervening 12 months, and with just a few days to go, how things are going to pan out, at least in the short term. And we'll catch up with you again a few months down the line, as you say, to find out, once the dust has settled, or once the flour has settled, and we'll find out how it's all going and how it's all gone. Jules, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
And our thanks, of course, to Jules. Well, this week we heard about changes to the gluten-free labelling regulations in the United States. Next week we hear about changes to the regulations in the United Kingdom and across Europe. If you eat food out, you'll find this of great interest. It's all going to be changing from December. If you sell food from any kind of location, you seriously need to hear it. As they say, you don't know what you don't know, and not adhering to those changes could land you in deep trouble legally. We'll catch up with Caroline Benjamin, who's one of the leading lights in training people so they're up to speed with the changes, and she'll be on next week's programme. Plus, we hear from the American company that Ian was talking about a few minutes ago, that's making inroads into the markets in other countries. Yeah, Bob's Red Mill. We'll be hearing from them in next week's episode of the GFree Radio Show.
And that was the GFree Radio Show with Peter Stewart. And you. Thanks for listening. And remember, until next time, be good, be healthy, and be G-free.